Isabel Crane was the kind of journalist who never backed down until the night she vanished without a trace. Now, Detective Cole Mercer holds the last fragments of her investigation, a trail of secrets that powerful people would kill to keep, buried. As he unravels the truth behind her disappearance, he realizes one terrifying fact. Isabel knew too much, and now so does he. Isabel Crane had never been the type of person who felt the need to conform. Born and raised in a bustling city, she had always found herself on the outside, never quite fitting in with the crowds, the noise, or the expectations. But her brilliance, her ability to see patterns where others saw none, had made her a successful investigative journalist. That same brilliance drove her to constantly seek the truth, no matter the cost. When Isabel moved to Maple Hollow, she thought she was taking a break from the chaos of city life. She had left behind the endless noise, the constant pressure, and the dangerous stories that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. The quiet charm of Maple Hollow, with its rolling hills and tightly knit community, seemed like the perfect place for her to recharge. She rented a small, quaint apartment above a bakery and started settling into the rhythm of small-town life. But it didn't take long before the old instincts kicked in. It was a story that had caught her attention, something that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. But to Isabel, it was anything but. HelixGuard, a private security firm that had recently set up shop just outside town, had piqued her curiosity. Locals seemed to think of it as a harmless company, one of many that provided security to rich estates and businesses. The company's website spoke of advanced security systems and protection for high-profile clients. But Isabel had a different perspective. She was no stranger to the world of corporate espionage, shady dealings, and covert operations. There was something about HelixGuard that didn't sit right with her. The way their employees always seemed to disappear when things went wrong, the way the company never seemed to appear in the press, the vague references to classified operations. It all pointed to something much more sinister than a simple security firm. Isabel wasn't just intrigued by the company. She was driven by the need to uncover its secrets. Late at night, after the town had settled into its quiet slumber, she would pore over public records, digging into HelixGuard's past. She found whispers of former employees who had left under mysterious circumstances, and traces of people who had simply vanished after crossing paths with the firm. But it wasn't until she stumbled upon a name, Jonas Merck, that her investigation took a darker turn. Merck had been a former operative with HelixGuard. He had disappeared a few years ago, and while the company claimed he left for personal reasons, Isabel found inconsistencies in the timeline. Merck was the key to something bigger, something dangerous. The more Isabel dug, the more she uncovered about HelixGuard's involvement in surveillance, blackmail, and even cases of forced disappearances. She found links to several high-profile political figures and corporate elites. But no one knew the full extent of what was happening behind the closed doors of that seemingly harmless security firm. Isabel's obsession with the case grew stronger by the day. She began visiting the HelixGuard office, pretending to be a potential client, asking questions under the guise of a story about private security. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes, seemed eager to brush her off. Isabel wasn't deterred. She started following HelixGuard employees around town, taking photographs and documenting everything. She made contacts in the police department, in local businesses, even in the bars where HelixGuard's operatives occasionally drank away their evenings. Slowly, a picture began to form. What Isabel didn't know was that she had become a target. HelixGuard had long since realized that anyone who dug too deep into their affairs didn't just become a nuisance, they became a threat. And Isabel was a threat like no other. She was brilliant, determined, and relentless in her pursuit of the truth. She wasn't the type to back down, even when things started getting dangerous. For weeks, Isabel's life continued as usual on the outside. She attended local events, greeted her neighbors with a smile, and continued her investigation behind closed doors. But Isabel's growing paranoia couldn't be ignored. She started seeing things out of the corner of her eye. Strange vehicles parked near her apartment, unfamiliar faces in town, and the unmistakable feeling that someone was always watching her. She tried to push the fear aside, but it gnawed at her, a constant reminder that her search for the truth had put her in the crosshairs of powerful people. Isabel wasn't the type to be intimidated. She believed that the truth, no matter how dangerous, had to come to light. She kept her findings in a hidden compartment inside her apartment, meticulously organized on encrypted drives. She even made copies of everything, ensuring that if anything happened to her, her work would survive. She had already written down the first draft of a story that could change everything. A story that would expose HelixGuard for what it truly was. But before she could finish, things began to spiral out of control. One day, Isabel didn't show up for her morning routine. She wasn't at the local diner, where she usually spent her mornings sipping coffee and reading the papers. Ruth Mailry, her elderly neighbor, grew concerned and tried calling her, but there was no answer. Isabel's phone went straight to voicemail, and when Ruth knocked on her door, there was no response. Ruth immediately called the police. They arrived soon after, and the officers found Isabel's apartment door locked from the inside. Nothing appeared to be missing, and there were no signs of forced entry. But Isabel was gone. Her journal was missing. So were her encrypted drives, and with that, Maple Hollow's quiet facade began to crack, revealing a much darker underbelly than anyone could have ever imagined. Isabel Crane had known too much, and now she was gone. But her investigation, and the truth she had been getting closer to, would not stay buried for long. Detective Cole Mercer had worked in Maple Hollow for over a decade. He had seen his share of strange events, unsolved thefts, feuds that turned violent, even the occasional missing person. But nothing had ever unsettled him quite like the disappearance of Isabel Crane. There was no chaos, no blood, no broken windows, just a locked apartment, a missing woman, and an overwhelming silence that suggested something far more calculated. Isabel hadn't simply vanished. She had been removed. Mercer wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but as he examined Isabel's apartment, he felt it in his gut. Something was off. Her furniture was untouched, dishes still in the sink, a half-written notepad left on the table. But what disturbed him most was the emptiness of the space where her laptop had been. It wasn't just gone. It had been taken, carefully, as if the person who removed it knew exactly what they were looking for. There was no sign of struggle, which suggested precision. He began his investigation by speaking with Ruth Mailry, Isabel's elderly neighbor. Ruth was visibly shaken. She explained how Isabel had been keeping to herself more than usual in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Ruth mentioned a black SUV she had seen parked near the apartment building at odd hours, usually after midnight. It always stayed for about an hour before disappearing down the road without headlights. Ruth had assumed it was someone visiting. Another tenant, but now, in hindsight, it didn't feel right. Mercer took down the details and requested traffic camera footage from nearby intersections. It took some digging, but eventually, he found what he was looking for. The black SUV showed up on several nights, parked in the same area around the same time. The license plate led to a company that didn't exist, at least not publicly. Shell Corporation with ties to dozens of other entities, all tracing back to one name, HelixGuard. He drove out to the edge of town where HelixGuard's facility was located. The building looked sterile and modern, with tall fences and security, cameras posted at every corner. Inside, a receptionist greeted him politely but seemed overly rehearsed. When Mercer inquired about Isabel, the woman smiled tightly and said she had no record of anyone by that name contacting them. He asked to speak to a supervisor, but was told no one was available. Every answer felt scripted, every smile forced. Bax. At the station, Mercer began researching HelixGuard more seriously. He combed through public records, financial documents, and any leaks he could find. Most of the information was vague and inconsistent, but a few patterns stood out. The company had connections to several private intelligence contractors, and there were multiple lawsuits filed against them, none of which ever went to trial. Settlements were made quickly and quietly. The names of the plaintiffs were usually redacted. The deeper he went, the more he felt like he was peeling back the layers of something rotten. That's when he found the name Jonas Merck. Merck had once been a field operative for HelixGuard, but had gone off the grid 2 years ago. Some reports described him as a whistleblower, others as a rogue agent. There were rumors that Merck had compiled evidence against the company before disappearing. His last known location? Maple Hollow. Mercer wondered if Isabel had found Merck, or if Merck had found her. If she had made contact, it would explain why she became a target. But there was no record of any communication between them. Mercer searched Isabel's apartment again, this time more thoroughly. Behind a loose panel in the wall of her closet, he discovered something, a buried tin box, carefully hidden. Inside were USB drives, hand-drawn maps, and several printed photographs. One photo showed Jonas Merck, unmistakably him, standing outside what appeared to be a rural property. Another image showed him speaking to a man whose face was half-turned but still visible. Neither figure looked aware of the camera. There were scribbled notes in Isabel's handwriting, phrases like Target 7 and confirmed connection to Operation Halcyon. The most chilling item was a document labeled simply HelixGuard, Elimination Protocol, Red Tier. On the second page was a list of names, the seventh name down, Isabel Crane. Mercer stared at the document, feeling a cold wave of dread wash over him. Isabel hadn't just been digging into a shady company. She had uncovered something truly lethal, a system, possibly sanctioned at the highest levels, for removing individuals who threatened exposure. Journalists, whistleblowers, rogue operatives. People like Isabel. He made encrypted backups of the drives and stored them in multiple places. He didn't know who he could trust anymore. If HelixGuard was watching Isabel, they might be watching him now too. But one thing was clear. He couldn't stop. He had to find out what happened to her, no matter the risk. She had uncovered a secret most people weren't meant to know. And now that he had seen even a part of it, he realized something terrifying. They weren't just cleaning up loose ends, they were eliminating them. Cole Mercer's nights had become sleepless. Each hour passed with the weight of unearthed truths and the creeping fear that he too might vanish like Isabel. Every knock on his door, every unfamiliar car parked down the street, felt like the beginning of something irreversible. But fear didn't paralyze him, it sharpened him. He knew that he was getting too close, that every step forward meant stepping deeper into the shadows that Isabel had barely begun to uncover. Mercer took the photographs and documents Isabel had hidden and cross-referenced them with law enforcement databases. He ran facial recognition on the man Jonas Merck had been speaking to in the photo. The results were disturbing. The man's name was Victor Rulson, a former intelligence analyst who had been implicated in a series of off-the-record operations involving surveillance and coercion. Officially, he had retired 5 years ago. Unofficially, he had gone dark, after being named in a redacted federal inquiry. Mercer suspected this meeting between Merck and Rulson was more than a coincidence. Isabel had likely captured it as proof of HelixGuard's reach into government networks. If these men were connected, then it explained everything, why Isabel had been marked, why HelixGuard had gone silent, and why Mercer now felt like he was being hunted. He didn't tell anyone at the precinct about the files. The risk was too high. He began working from an old hunting cabin outside town, a place few knew existed. It was isolated and quiet, but most importantly, it felt safe, at least for now. There, Mercer decrypted one of the drives and discovered a folder named Echo Wire. Inside were dozens of audio files, recordings of phone calls, meetings, and intercepted conversations. Isabel had somehow gained access to internal HelixGuard surveillance. The recordings revealed discussions of a containment protocol and repeated references to tier-red targets. Isabel's voice even appeared in one of the recordings, captured in what sounded like a phone call. That's when Mercer realized she had known. Isabel had been aware they were onto her. She spoke calmly in the call, saying, "If anything happens to me, someone will finish what I started." The words hit Mercer like a punch to the gut. She had always known she might not make it to the end, but she trusted someone would. Mercer dove into the rest of the files. One stood out above the others. It was a video file labeled Merc Final. The footage was grainy, time-stamped from a year ago. It showed Jonas Merc, looking thinner and more tired than the last known images of him. He sat in a dimly lit room, speaking directly to the camera. HelixGuard operates under the protection of people with influence, he said. They're not just a company. They're a mechanism for silence. If you're watching this, I'm probably already gone. And if you think you're safe, you're not. That video confirmed what Mercer feared. HelixGuard didn't just protect high-profile clients. They were in the business of erasing threats, people, data, even entire histories. Isabel had become one of those threats, and now, by possessing this evidence, so had he. Mercer needed help, but the kind he could trust. He reached out to an old contact, Lara Venn, a cybercrime specialist who had left the bureau after exposing internal corruption. Lara had gone underground years ago, operating as a freelance digital investigator. Reaching her wasn't easy. He used an encrypted burner phone and an alias, leaving only one clue she'd recognize. Isabel Crane, Tier Red, Echo Wire. 3 days later, Lara responded with coordinates and a single sentence. "Meet me alone. Burn everything you bring." When Mercer arrived, Lara was waiting inside an abandoned train depot miles from the nearest highway. She looked older, more hardened, but her mind was as sharp as ever. After scanning the drives, she sat in silence, brows furrowed. "This is bigger than anything Isabel ever told me," she finally said. "These aren't just surveillance files. These are keys, access codes, secure tunnels, bank records. This isn't just about disappearing people. It's about controlling governments." Lara believed Isabel had been preparing to leak everything through a secure drop. The files weren't just evidence. They were the master map of a silent empire. If released, they would expose powerful figures across multiple continents. But Isabel had never gotten the chance. Lara warned Mercer that moving forward meant war. Every step would draw HelixGuard closer. And if they released the files too soon, or to the wrong people, the entire thing could be buried before it even surfaced. They needed a plan. That night, as Mercer left the depot, headlights flickered behind him. A vehicle began following, keeping just enough distance to avoid suspicion. He made sharp turns, detours, and last-minute exits, but the car stayed close. His pulse quickened. He knew then that the hunt had begun in earnest. There was no more time for caution. HelixGuard was closing. And if he was going to survive, he had to do what Isabel had started, expose them, before he disappeared too. Cole Mercer had always believed that justice was about truth, but now truth felt like a weapon too dangerous to hold. Every move he made was shadowed. Every step forward met with a whisper of dread. HelixGuard wasn't just watching anymore. They were closing in. The car that had followed him from Lara's depot didn't just vanish. It showed up again the next night, parked a block from his cabin, engine still warm when he found it. He knew he had little time left. He relocated that night, taking only the drives and a backpack. The rest he left behind. He didn't expect to return. With Lara's help, he secured a series of anonymous servers to store and encrypt the contents of Isabel's files. They began drafting a strategy, a carefully timed release of select documents spread across several international journalists and advocacy groups. The goal wasn't just exposure, it was survival. If the truth lived in multiple places, it couldn't be erased as easily as Isabel had been. But just as they began preparing the first transmission, Lara received an alert. One of their servers had been breached. It hadn't even gone live yet, and someone had already found it. The breach hadn't compromised any files, but it was enough to send a message. HelixGuard knew what they had, and they were coming fast. Mercer and Lara abandoned the server plan and switched to physical media. They prepared a set of flash drives, each containing portions of the Echo Wire files and key evidence from Isabel's research. These were given to trusted contacts Lara had built over the years: activists, journalists, a former judge, all people with no direct ties to either of them, but with enough conviction to act if something happened. The night before they planned to leave the country, Mercer returned briefly to Maple Hollow. He needed closure. Isabel's apartment had been cleaned out by her landlord weeks ago, but he managed to slip inside undetected. The room felt even colder now. Hollow, like her presence had been scrubbed from the walls. He stood silently in the middle of the living room, letting the weight of her work, her sacrifice, settle in his chest. Then he noticed something strange. Near the window, behind the radiator, a faint glint of metal caught his eye. He reached down and retrieved it. A small, flat pendant, something personal. Inside was a folded slip of paper, impossibly thin, handwritten in tiny, precise script. It was a note from Isabel. "Don't be afraid to be loud. That's the only way we win. If they find you, make sure everyone hears." Mercer clutched the note. It wasn't just a message, it was a command. By the next morning, he and Lara were gone. They moved through remote routes, crossed borders using identities Lara had spent years preparing. In a cold, crowded train somewhere near the coast, Lara handed him a burner phone. "It's time," she said simply. Mercer made the call. One by one, their contacts released the information. First to independent media outlets, then to global watchdog organizations. Within hours, the files began appearing online. Redacted reports, surveillance logs, audio from confidential government meetings, everything HelixGuard had tried to bury was now in the light. The response was immediate. News networks exploded with coverage. Political figures issued statements of concern. Protests erupted in cities across the globe. Lawsuits were filed, investigations launched, and though many officials tried to deny any connection, the damage was already done. HelixGuard's name became toxic overnight. Their stock plummeted, their contracts were suspended, key executives vanished or went silent, but Mercer knew better. This wasn't an ending, it was a fracture. For every office that closed, another remained hidden. For every document released, there were 100 more still buried. HelixGuard didn't die. It simply shifted, adapting like a virus. But now, the world had seen it, at least a glimpse. And that glimpse couldn't be taken back. A month later, in a quiet coastal town across the ocean, Mercer sat at a cafe overlooking the water. He wore a different face now, different name, different history. Lara had gone underground again, and he suspected she'd never stop running. Neither would he, but that was the price of surviving truth. He pulled out Isabel's pendant from his pocket and opened it again, reading the final line of her note. "Be loud." He didn't know if justice had been served. Maybe it never truly could be, not when the enemy operated in shadows. But the silence had been broken. Isabel's voice, her truth, had echoed farther than anyone had expected. And somewhere in that echo, the world had started to listen.